Have you ever wondered what really went on inside Boris Johnson's number 10? Well, today we are cracking open Johnson at 10, the inside story. It's an absolutely revealing look at his premiership by the political historian Anthony Seldon and his co-author Raymond Newell. And look, this is not just a timeline of events. Oh no, it is a deep dive into the character of a leader and the massive impact he had on a nation.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to unpack the book's central argument about Johnson the man. Then, we'll look at how his time in power was really defined by those two huge crises, Brexit and COVID. After that, we are going to boil it all down to the three most critical takeaways from the entire book. Then, we'll get to the final verdict on his premiership before asking that big question. Was his downfall always going to happen?
So let's get right to the heart of it. What's the book's big idea? Well, Seldon and Newell argue that Johnson's story was pretty much written long before he ever got the keys to number 10.
Exactly. The book kicks off with this incredibly powerful line from T.S. Eliot. And you know, this isn't just some fancy opening sentence. The authors are basically saying this is the key that unlocks their entire analysis. Their whole point is that the story of Johnson's fall from power actually begins with his rise.
Right. They frame his entire premiership as a kind of classic Greek tragedy. The argument is that his personality, that irrepressible and lawless character, was his superpower and his fatal flaw. It's what made him an incredible campaigner, but in their view, an impossible person to actually govern. For Seldon and Newell, it all comes down to one thing. Character is destiny.
And this timeline really shows what they mean. The book tracks this character all through his career. As editor of The Spectator, he's called brilliant, but also totally unmanageable, frequently absent, and famously late. As mayor of London, he was the ultimate showman. Who can forget him stuck on that zip wire? And then for the Brexit campaign, the book quotes George Osborne saying Johnson was the trump card that made it okay for the middle ground to vote leave. In every single case, it's the same traits at play. Pure charisma, a bit of chaos, and this just uncanny ability to connect with people.
So with that character in mind, how did it all actually play out when he got to the top job? Well, the authors frame his entire time in number 10 around two gigantic crises. Brexit, which was the political storm he was trying to tame, and then COVID-19, the global disaster that just came out of nowhere.
To break that Brexit deadlock, the book shows how Johnson's team, led by the notorious Dominic Cummings, basically launched a political blitzkrieg. First, they used prorogation, which is just a fancy word for suspending Parliament, to shut down the opposition. Then they unleashed this massive Get Ready for Brexit campaign to prove they were serious about a no-deal exit. And finally, they called a snap election and just hammered home that one simple, incredibly powerful slogan, Get Brexit Done. It was a huge gamble, but it completely reshaped the political map.
But then, COVID hits. And the book presents the pandemic as this ultimate, unforeseen test. See, if Brexit was a political crisis Johnson could shape with strategy and slogans, COVID was a scientific, logistical nightmare that needed a totally different kind of leadership. And the authors argue this is where the system and the leader really started to show some cracks.
And this quote really gets to the heart of the problem. Seldon and Newell say that Johnson's core beliefs, his deep libertarian instincts, made him just fundamentally unsuited for a pandemic. The decision to lock down the entire country was for him this massive ideological battle. The authors even say he was inspired by the mayor in the movie Jaws. The guy who wanted to keep the beaches open even with the shark in the water. It was his gut instinct versus the scientific reality.
And here's where the book paints a really telling picture. When Johnson himself was in the hospital with COVID, his deputy, Dominic Raab, took the reins. The authors quote officials who say Raab's leadership was orderly, a time when ministers behaved. This is put in sharp contrast to when Johnson returned, where meetings were described as just chaotic, with him jumping from one topic to another. It's a really powerful way to show the difference in leadership styles when the pressure was on.
Okay, so that brings us to the real core of the book's analysis. If you're going to boil down this entire incredibly detailed history, Seldon and Newell are basically saying there are three crucial takeaways that truly define the Johnson premiership.
All right, first up, and this is the big one. It takes us right back to where we started.
The number one argument in this book is that Johnson's character wasn't just a part of the story, it was the story. His charisma got him there, but his lawless nature was his undoing. They point to this deep-seated need to avoid confrontation, even quoting him telling an aide he couldn't challenge his wife Carrie because my mental health will not stand it. They also say the decision to back Dominic Cummings over the whole Barnard Castle trip was a massive turning point. It signaled that personal loyalty was more important than the rules, and that set the stage for Partygate and everything that came after. The bottom line, The authors put the blame squarely on him.
All right, the second major takeaway is all about Johnson's relationship with the very government he was supposed to be leading. And this is where things get really interesting. The book puts Johnson side by side with his political hero, the 19th century Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Now, Disraeli believed his job was to defend British institutions, but the authors argue Johnson attacked them, Parliament, the courts, the civil service. Where Disraeli was serious-minded, Johnson was often frivolous. And the final verdict here is just brutal. They call him a leader who, instead of mastering the office, let the servants run riot in the citadel. It suggests the fundamental disregard for the actual job of being prime minister.
And that leads us perfectly into the third and final key takeaway from the book.
Right! The crucial idea here is the massive difference between campaigning and governing. The authors say Johnson's greatest talent was winning. He was a disruptor, an insurgent, a truly brilliant campaigner. But those exact same skills, the chaos, the focus on catchy slogans, the dislike of details, well, they became huge problems once he was actually in power and had to, run the country.
And this quote just captures that failure perfectly. The book tells the story of Johnson's infamous speech to the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry. This was supposed to be a serious event, a chance to connect with business leaders. Instead, he completely lost his place in his notes, started making car noises, and then went on this long, rambling tangent about a trip to Peppa Pig World. For the authors, this wasn't just a funny mistake, it was the perfect metaphor for a campaigner who just couldn't make that crucial switch to serious, disciplined governing.
Now, it's important to say this book isn't just a takedown. Seldon and Newell are proper historians, and they really try to give a balanced verdict. They absolutely acknowledge the big achievements right alongside what they see as the deep, deep failures.
On the plus side, the book really zeroes in on three major wins. First, the vaccine rollout, which Michael Gove is quoted as calling the fastest in the world. The authors give Johnson credit for picking the right people and taking risks. Second is his leadership on Ukraine. They say he was truly catalytic in pushing the world to do more. And third, they point out that his time in office marked a definitive break with austerity, pushing up the tax burden to fund a much more active government. But then there's the other side of the ledger. The book details some major limitations. The operation inside number 10 is described as toxic, dysfunctional, and the worst since 1916. We've already talked about the airy disregard for institutions. The authors also point to damaged relationships with allies, especially with French President Macron, who apparently told Johnson, "Boris, you're just not being serious." And finally, they point to a really inconsistent and conflicted response to COVID, driven by his personal hesitation to bring in restrictions.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together and get to the book's ultimate conclusion. Was the chaotic end to his premiership a surprise, or was it, like the author suggests from the very first page, basically inevitable?
Yeah, the book's final verdict is crystal clear. The scandals that brought him down, like Partygate and the Chris Pincher affair, they weren't the actual cause of his downfall. Instead, they argue they were the inevitable symptoms of those character traits that were there all along. So despite the huge crises and the massive election win, the authors conclude that Boris Johnson was the sole architect of his own defeat.
And so, Seldon and Newell leave us with the central question that really hangs over this entire story. Was Boris Johnson's premiership a classic tragedy, where a flawed hero's downfall was written in the stars from day one? Or was it the story of a leader who was given a historic opportunity to respond to crisis and who simply failed to rise to the occasion? The book makes a very strong argument, but ultimately it leaves that final judgment to history.